The Postal Service was the perfect intelligence network that nobody thought about. Every day millions of pieces of mail moved through predictable routes, handled by people society had trained itself to ignore. James Parker had realized this during his first week on the job. Mailmen saw everything and were noticed by no one. For a former federal agent trying to live quietly, it should have been the perfect retirement, until he started noticing things that made quiet retirement impossible. Welcome to Stories of Secret Heroes. Before we begin this powerful story of hidden vigilance and moral courage, tell me in the comments, from which city are you watching today? And if you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, hit that subscribe button and help us honor those who protect others, even when they're supposed to be invisible. James Parker had been delivering mail for 8 years, but he'd been watching people for 23. The transition from federal agent to postal worker hadn't been planned. A case had gone sideways, putting him in the crosshairs of people who held grudges across decades. The Bureau had offered him a new identity and a quiet job somewhere far from Washington's intrigue. The Postal Service had seemed perfect: steady work, predictable routes, minimal interaction with the kind of people who made their living in shadows. James could disappear into the uniform, blend into the background, and spend his remaining working years doing something useful without the constant threat assessment that had dominated his previous career. What he hadn't expected was how much his training would follow him into civilian life. James's route covered 3 zip codes on the east side of Richmond, a mix of residential neighborhoods, small businesses, and apartment complexes that housed everyone from college students to retirees. He'd walked these streets for 8 years, delivered mail to the same addresses, watched the same patterns of daily life unfold at the same times every day. But where other postal workers saw routine, James saw intelligence. His mind automatically catalogued information that 15 years of federal investigations had taught him to notice: who got mail from where, which addresses received packages that didn't match the neighborhood's economic profile, how frequently certain businesses got correspondence, and from which countries. It was pattern recognition on autopilot, a mental habit he couldn't shut off even when he wanted to. Most of the patterns were innocent. Mrs. Henderson on Maple Street got medication deliveries every month because she had diabetes. The Garcia family received regular packages from relatives in Mexico. The college apartment complex had constant turnover, with mail forwarding requests that reflected young people's transient lifestyles, but some patterns made James's trained instincts twitch with recognition. There was a cluster of apartments on Riverside Drive that bothered him. 5 different units, all receiving mail for multiple names, sometimes 8 or 9 different people per address. The names changed every few months, but the pattern stayed consistent. High-volume mail delivery to addresses that should house single families or small groups. The packages were wrong too. Expensive items, electronics, clothing, jewelry, going to rundown apartments where the visible residents clearly couldn't afford such purchases. International shipping labels from countries known for manufacturing counterfeits, but also from legitimate businesses that seemed oddly connected to these specific addresses. Then there were the businesses. 3 different storefronts on his route that claimed to be import-export companies, but never seemed to have customers, employees, or any visible business activity. They received massive amounts of international correspondence and frequent visits from delivery trucks, but James had never seen anyone actually working there during normal business hours. For 6 months, James had tried to ignore what his training was telling him. He was a postal worker now, not an investigator. His job was to deliver mail, not to analyze criminal networks or identify suspicious activity. He'd left that life behind for good reasons, but the patterns kept getting stronger. More addresses, more suspicious packages, more businesses that existed only on paper but moved significant amounts of mail and money through the system. James Parker, former federal agent, recognized the infrastructure of a human trafficking operation when he saw one. The realization came on a Tuesday morning in March. He was delivering mail to 8047 Riverside Drive, one of the suspicious apartments, when a young woman answered the door. She couldn't have been more than 18, with the kind of hollow-eyed exhaustion that James had seen in victims of serious crimes. She took the mail without speaking, but James noticed her hands were shaking, and there were bruises on her wrists that looked like restraint marks. When she turned to close the door, he caught a glimpse of the apartment interior: multiple mattresses on the floor, chains on the windows, and shadows of other people who didn't come to the door. That night, James sat in his small apartment and tried to convince himself he'd misinterpreted what he'd seen. Maybe the girl was just tired. Maybe the apartment setup was just poverty, not imprisonment. Maybe 15 years of investigating the worst of human nature had made him paranoid about innocent situations. But James Parker had been trained by the FBI to trust his instincts, and his instincts were screaming that people were being hurt on his mail route. The next morning, he started paying closer attention to 8047 Riverside Drive and the 4 other suspicious addresses in that cluster. He began noting who came and went, what vehicles were used, which apartments had lights on at unusual hours. Not officially investigating, just observing with the kind of trained awareness that had once been his job. What he discovered over the next week made his blood run cold. The apartments were connected, same vehicles visiting multiple addresses, same people moving between locations at predictable times, mail patterns that suggested the addresses were being used as distribution points for something that required constant movement of people and resources. Most telling were the international money transfers. James recognized the routing patterns from his federal days, the kind of complex financial networks used to move money across borders without creating obvious paper trails. The businesses on his route weren't import-export companies. They were money laundering operations supporting a human trafficking network that used his postal district as a hub. James faced the same choice that had driven him out of federal service 8 years earlier: stay quiet and safe, or get involved in something dangerous because it was the right thing to do. This time, getting involved meant more than risking his own safety. It meant risking the quiet life he'd built, the anonymity that kept him safe from old enemies, and the peaceful routine that had helped him heal from decades of seeing humanity's darkest impulses. But it also meant potentially saving people who were being bought and sold on his mail route while he delivered their captors' correspondence. James made his decision on a Friday afternoon when he delivered a package to 851 Riverside Drive and heard crying from inside the apartment. Not adult crying, children crying, young voices speaking languages he didn't recognize, sounding scared and far from home. That weekend, James Parker began doing what James Parker did best: building a case. He used vacation days to conduct surveillance. He documented vehicle patterns, photographed license plates, and recorded the times and frequencies of suspicious activity. He traced the financial networks by analyzing the mail patterns, identifying the flow of money and correspondence that kept the operation running. Most importantly, he gathered evidence in a way that wouldn't compromise an official investigation. James knew that if he was right about what was happening, this case would eventually require federal resources, far beyond anything he could provide as a retired agent working alone. After 2 weeks of careful documentation, James had assembled enough evidence to convince any reasonable investigator that a significant human trafficking operation was using his postal route as a distribution network. The question was how to get that evidence to people who could act on it without revealing his own background or compromising the investigation. James solved the problem the way he'd solved complex cases for 15 years. He found the right person and gave them exactly the information they needed to do their job. Agent Sarah Mitchell was a human trafficking specialist with the FBI's Richmond field office. James had researched her background, confirmed her reputation, and verified that she was someone who would take action on credible intelligence. He mailed her a comprehensive package of evidence: photographs, address patterns, financial analysis, and behavioral observations, along with a note explaining that the information came from a concerned postal worker who noticed suspicious patterns on his route. 3 days later, coordinated raids on 7 addresses in James's district resulted in the rescue of 23 victims of human trafficking, the arrest of 12 perpetrators, and the seizure of financial assets worth over $2 million. The news coverage described it as a breakthrough in a multi-state investigation, made possible by an observant postal employee who reported suspicious activity to federal authorities. James's name never appeared in any report, and his role was described only as a mail carrier who noticed unusual patterns and contacted the FBI, which was, James reflected, perfectly accurate. He had noticed patterns, he had contacted the FBI, and he was indeed a mail carrier. The fact that he was also a retired federal agent with 15 years of investigative experience was information that nobody needed to have. 6 months later, James Parker was back to his regular route, delivering mail to addresses that were now occupied by legitimate residents. The trafficking network had been dismantled, its financial infrastructure destroyed, and its victims relocated to safety and support services. James continued his quiet life as a postal worker, walking the same streets, delivering the same mail, maintaining the same invisible presence that had allowed him to operate effectively during the investigation. But now his supervisors listened when he reported suspicious activity, and his observations were taken seriously by law enforcement, not because they knew who he used to be, but because he'd proven that postal workers saw things other people missed, and that patterns noticed by someone who walked the same routes every day were worth investigating. James Parker had spent 15 years as a federal agent protecting people from criminals who thought they were invisible. Now he spent his days as a postal worker, still protecting people from criminals who thought they were invisible, one mail delivery at a time. The uniform was different, the authority was unofficial, and the recognition was non-existent. But the mission remained the same: noticing what others missed, connecting dots that others couldn't see, and making sure that people who preyed on the vulnerable didn't operate unnoticed in his neighborhood. Some investigators retire to golf courses and vacation homes. Others retire to postal routes where they can keep watching, keep protecting, and keep serving, just quietly enough that the people who need to be stopped never see them coming. James Parker delivered mail for 25 years, but he never stopped being an investigator. He just learned to investigate while wearing a postal uniform and carrying a mailbag instead of a badge and a gun. So I ask you, have you ever met someone like James Parker? Someone whose past profession followed them into retirement, who used ordinary work to do extraordinary service. Share their name in the comments, tell us their story, because here at Stories of Secret Heroes, we believe the greatest protectors are often the ones who deliver more than just mail. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, subscribe and share it with someone who needs to remember that heroes come in all uniforms. Sometimes they're the ones who know your address by heart and notice when something's not right in your neighborhood. Stories of Secret Heroes, where the watchers never really stop watching.